Hello and welcome to BHCOE's monthly business development series. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day and for joining us for today's webinar about HIPAA vulnerabilities. My name is Sarah Litvak and I am the CEO here at the Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, and I'll be the host of today's webinar. For those of you who haven't yet attended one of our monthly webinars, welcome. And for those of you who have attended, welcome back. We're always happy to see that these webinars have been a useful resource for you. Christine Ratcliffe is the one who curates the topics that are discussed in these webinars. So if you have any suggestions or ideas, feel free to reach out to her directly so she can add those to our list. Her email is christine@bhcoe.org. The goal of the series is to help you as business owners, directors, and supervisors access relevant information that can help run your organization more effectively, more efficiently, and with an eye for ensuring continuous improvement. So today's webinar topic is very timely because BHCOE is constantly accessing and interacting with privatized health information, as are you, and our organization often sees large-scale HIPAA vulnerabilities. And these are areas that are quick fixes that can help you reduce your risk and liability. So I'm excited to discuss this further. Just a bit of context for those of you who aren't familiar with BHCOE accreditation yet. We are the only accrediting body that's specific to ABA organizations. And accreditation is an important oversight component that allows the organization to be held accountable for a set of standards, in addition to the individual practitioner standards that are overseen by the BACB. It also provides a standardized peer review process for ABA organizations that allows them to benchmark their progress on things like patient outcome, turnover, staff satisfaction, and patient satisfaction. We take a lot of pride in the work we do, and I, with our board and subject matter experts, work to create a BHCOE code that helps our organizations impact their consumers positively. If you're interested in learning who's accredited nearby, you can always go to our website and go to this members directory here and look to see who's in your area. We also have a compliance concern section on our website. I want to just remind you that if you have any concerns and are not able to address them directly with the provider, you can always list those here. You can fill this out and you will be provided information about next steps, and we really hope to remediate any of these concerns that you might have. We also have some current open employment opportunities. So if you know of anyone who's interested, you're welcome to fill out our employment ad. If you go to the Contact Us section on our website, there's a section under there for employment opportunities. And we're currently hiring in the Midwest, the Southeast, and the East Coast. So a couple housekeeping items. If you're listening to this, that means that you're listening to the recorded version of the webinar. So what that means is that unfortunately you're not able to access CEUs. That being said, all of our Virtual Academy webinars are available for free for all of the members that are on our website right now. You can also download the presentation slides and add additional information. Again, if you're not viewing this live, the CEUs are not available for recorded webinars. So as you are getting settled in, it looks like we have some folks joining, so a few other things to know before we get started. Since you're not watching the live version of this, you will notice there's going to be some Q&A throughout the webinar. If you have any additional questions, our presenter today will have his contact information at the end of the slides, and you're always welcome to reach out to him directly. You can also reach out through our info@ email address if you have any other questions. So it sounds like we're ready to get started, so I'd like to introduce to you Nick Merkin. Nick Merkin is the Chief Executive Officer of Compliagent, a national healthcare compliance consulting firm based in Los Angeles. As part of his consulting practice, he frequently serves as a fractional or interim Chief Compliance Officer for organizations experiencing rapid growth, enforcement challenges, or in the process of merger and acquisition. Nick has a thorough knowledge of complex and rapidly changing state and federal laws and policies regarding organizational governance issues, board oversight, liability, compliance auditing, the Stark Law, the Anti-Kickback Statute, HIPAA privacy, data security, and the False Claims Act. He also has particular expertise in areas of alternative payment methods, innovative provider structures for networks within the healthcare industry. He earned his JD from Columbia Law School, where he was also named a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar and served as managing editor of the Columbia Journal of Law and Social Problems. Nick was also awarded an MBA from Tel Aviv University's Merkin School of Business and a BA from the University of Pennsylvania. That being said, I'm going to hand it over to Nick.
So good morning. I know that Sarah started off by saying that she was really looking forward to hearing about HIPAA compliance, which you would not find it hard to believe that that's a minority opinion among people in the healthcare world. HIPAA has a reputation of being, it's kind of a well-deserved reputation at times of being a little bit dry and a little bit arcane and technical and having a lot of legalese surrounding it. So here's the good news and the bad news. The bad news is I'm a lawyer by background. I spent probably about the first 8 or 9 years of my career defending in the litigation context different kinds of healthcare organizations in cases of compliance violations, a lot of interaction with the government and sometimes defending cases against plaintiffs' lawyers and class action lawyers and stuff like that. About 6 or 7 years ago, I decided to leave that a little bit aside and start a consulting firm called Compliagent, which I still run today, and which the idea is to be proactive and build out regulatory compliance infrastructure for healthcare organizations and providers. And HIPAA is a big component of that. And so the good news part of this is I'm not as boring as usual lawyer presentations. And so a little bit programmatic note, you know, HIPAA is a very broad space, and there are HIPAA obligations that have to do both with protecting PHI, and we'll talk a little bit about what PHI is, but essentially protecting private health information. And there are also obligations in terms of producing that PHI at the request of different parties, particularly your patients. What we're going to cover today, we can't really possibly cover the whole spectrum of HIPAA compliance. What we're going to focus on today is what I think is the most effective thing to focus on in sort of basic HIPAA training, which is best practices as to how to prevent HIPAA breaches and HIPAA violations in that regard. So a lot of what we'll talk about today will be, what is the best advice out there in the healthcare industry that you can take back to your colleagues in your organizations and that you can implement yourselves to avoid any HIPAA problems. And let's talk a little bit about why that's important. I'm going to start off with a story. So a good friend of mine is in AUSA for healthcare out here in California, where I live. And AUSA is an assistant U.S. Attorney General, and I should say she recently left the U.S. Attorney's office a couple months ago and is now in private practice. But we talked a lot over the years, and we had lunch recently, and she told me, Nick, this is how things work in terms of healthcare enforcement, and I'll show you how this is, I think pretty relevant to thinking about HIPAA compliance. And she said, we sort of function as the enforcement arm of the U.S. government, almost like a plaintiff's lawyer would. And what she means by that is we like easy wins. We don't like to spend a lot of money on cases. I don't really want to go to trial. And the way I get promoted in the U.S. Attorney's Office is by closing cases, by getting fines and penalties, getting settlements from various organizations that have done things like HIPAA violations, other things like fraud and abuse and billing improprieties and things like that. But the big challenge, she told me, for her is how to identify that, because even though it's the US government, her resources are sort of spread thin. She might have one or two investigators and a paralegal who's able actually to go out there and investigate and find cases. So her strategy for doing that is the following. She has got a big stack of files on her desk on any given day of potential violations to go out and investigate. Send an investigator out to her organization and ask them simple questions. Don't even ask them about really what the underlying issue might be that they might eventually bring a lawsuit with respect to, but ask them simple questions. Where are your HIPAA? Can I see a copy of your HIPAA policies and procedures? Can I see a copy of your HIPAA training that you've used in the last 2 years? When you've, show me when you've onboarded new employees that HIPAA training is part of, is part of that onboarding process. And it's not so much, as she told me, it's not so much even the substance of the answers is what she's looking for. She's looking for the deer in headlights look. And where, and her philosophy is where there's smoke, there's fire. Even if I'm going in and I want to investigate a little bit of a bigger fish, right? Massive, billing fraud, something like that. I'll ask the simple questions first, because I know if I can find an organization where I ask a simple question like, let me see your, let me see your policies and procedures in this area. And the response is, oh, right here. Do you want it electronically? Do you want it in hard copy? Do you want it in this order? Do you want it in that order? How many copies do you need? You know, et cetera, et cetera. I know that that's probably an organization that's going to be a tough opponent. And that's probably an organization where there might be a little smoke, but there's probably not a lot of fire. But when I hear in response to that simple question, oh, well, I'm not sure, HIPAA policies, I think our IT guy knows where that is, but, he's part-time and he's actually in vacation for the next 2 weeks. Can can we get back to you then? And I promise I'll ask him. When the reaction is something like that, she told me, that's when I dig in. That's when I start asking the broader question. So, if you need any motivation aside from just, you don't want to breach your clients or your patients' confidential information for many reasons, both ethical and professional. Remember that story, because that is the kind of attitude, and it's not only with the Department of Justice or the U.S. Attorney's Office, it's true for state enforcement agencies as well. And that's the way that things that's the way enforcement happens and enforcement works. So one of the messages that I often tell to my clients is, don't only focus on the real bad issues or the real bad violations. Focus on, organization, documentation, the details of the little things, because it's those kind of things that if you get tripped up on might open a can of worms for you down the line. So good story, and I think it sets the context a little bit for why we're here today, and some of the things that I'm want to impart to you. So I told you a little bit about sort of why I left doing mainly litigation, which I see as something reactive, and started a business and started a firm that was going to focus on more proactive approaches to compliance. And what I saw too many times over the close to a decade when I was defending these kinds of things in court or in administrative hearings, was that people were spending a lot of money, and I mean a lot of money, because how expensive litigation is, once something bad already happened. And the analogy I always give is the emergency room versus your primary care provider. And I said, this system where we just have a reactive system, and there's really very little help out there for organizations that want to be proactive, want to do the right thing from the beginning, and avoid compliance violations that are going to result in those, the big spend and the big risk and the big liability. It was much harder to find. So, that was sort of my philosophy in doing what I do today and transitioning to that. And, I find it in a lot of ways more fulfilling. And, while I'll always say, just like an emergency room is always important, it is always important, to get good legal advice if you have a situation you need to react to. Ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's at least as equally important to, before things go wrong, put some thought into being proactive. And, how am I going to set up my compliance infrastructure, whether it's HIPAA, whether it's billing, whether it's quality, all the sorts of areas of compliance, concern, and enforcement, how you're going to look at that from the outset and not wait till a reactive situation. So what do you do about it? And I promise we're going to get to HIPAA, but I really do think it's important to sort of tell this story in the beginning. I like to call sword and shield. So risk management, a lot of what people think about is, okay, well, I'm going to do a risk assessment, I'm going to do some training, I'm going to put together policies and procedures, and that is going to proactively identify some areas where I need to do some more robust work with my sort of compliance function in my organization. And that's true, and that's right, and that's absolutely correct. But one of the things that I think people miss, and some of this is just my orientation of being a defense lawyer for most of my career, is the shield aspect of it. It's not only the fact that affirmatively, and I call that the sword, you're going to find problems and you're going to fix them, and that's true and important, but also that you're going to be able to lay a paper trail of the good faith that you put into compliance, and again, be it billing compliance, HIPAA compliance, patient safety, all sorts of things like that, you're going to be able to lay that paper trail and retain things and document things so that inevitably, and it, is inevitable with, if you're an organization that's been around for enough years and a big enough size and a big enough volume of care that you're delivering, you're eventually going to run into a HIPAA breach or a billing question or something along those lines. And you are going to be very well served by the fact that in the years preceding that, in the time leading up to that, you had your ducks in a row and you documented things. And you had a HIPAA breach, but you're able to show, yes, but we did our best. We had training every 6 months within our organization. When we onboarded our new employees, we went ahead and trained them within 30 days of hire. Here's all the sign-in sheets from that training. Here's copies of that training. Here's our policies and procedures regarding that. We reviewed them on a yearly basis and made sure they were up to date and current and as effective as they should be. When somebody when somebody did do something that violated policies and procedures, we maybe trained them better, or maybe there was performance issues and there was disciplinary issues. All sorts of things like that you're gonna, when you think proactively, you can document, are gonna go a long way towards mitigation of things like fines and penalties and any other kind of punitive thing. So what I would encourage you to look at big picture, to step outside of HIPAA for a second, is within the compliance infrastructure of your organization in general, have things like good compliance policies and procedures. Have someone who's designated to be something like your data privacy officer, your information privacy officer, your compliance officer. Train your staff in all the things they need to be trained on, everything from anti-kickback and Stark and gifts and things like that to HIPAA. Communicate internally effectively and document that communication. Audit and monitor your own compliance and things. Enforce standards in your policies and procedures and don't let things slide. And when there are compliance violations that you do detect and pick up, make sure you're documenting a robust and active response to those kind of things and in solving problems. So let's, now that I've kind of given you guys that introduction and sort of stories and background, let's now focus on HIPAA. And again, we're going to focus a lot on best practices right now, a lot of easy takeaways that you can take home to your organizations and your colleagues, and also the way you do business. So as you're probably aware, HIPAA is a federal law. It protects the privacy of what's called protected health information. So important to realize that it's federal, which obviously means no matter what state you might be in, it's going to operate. One thing to keep in mind, though, is depending on what state you're in, there might also be state privacy laws as well. So obviously, it's beyond the scope of this seminar today to go into every state's privacy laws, and very often HIPAA is more strict about things, so you just go with the HIPAA requirements. It should be mentioned, though, just as a technical matter, if you live in a state where there are state privacy regulations, particularly healthcare privacy regulations. In California, for example, there's something called CMIA, the California Medical Information Act. At times, they may have standards in those state laws that are more strict than HIPAA, and you should follow the more strict standard whenever there's sort of, a conflict between two different obligations. I would say not to sweat this too hard. I think 95% of the time you're going to be fine with HIPAA, but it's worth thinking about, and I thought it was important to impart that to you. So HIPAA in general is kind of part of two buckets, or comprised of two buckets: a privacy rule and a security rule. And the privacy rule deals with a lot of the things that you probably think of as HIPAA day to day. One is the protection of particular kinds of health information, how you can use that information, to whom you can disclose it and when, and who has rights to access that PHI. And so, we'll talk a little bit about its use and disclosure and protection today. Security rule is exactly as it sounds. It's how you protect it, a little bit more from a harder IT perspective. And we'll talk a little bit about what the elements of that in a couple slides from this. But you may hear people talking about the HIPAA privacy rule and the HIPAA security rule. They're both part of HIPAA, but they sort of address and are oriented towards some different types of obligations and requirements. So let's talk about what PHI is. You've heard this term. PHI stands for Protected Health Information, and HIPAA only applies to something if it's constitutes PHI. And these definitions are important because if you get to a point where you're trying to make an organizational determination of how you protect certain information, or if you have a breach, let's say, one of the things you're going to want to figure out or analyze is, well, was there really PHI involved? So it's important to know the definitions a little bit. So apologies for dropping a little bit into legalese, but PHI is defined as individually identifiable health information. So that's a pretty broad category. A lot of people think of the obvious things when they talk about, what's PHI, and that's like, your medical condition, past, present, or future, right? What illnesses you might have, how acute they are, what treatments you've had, what medications you might be taking. It can also be things that are not directly related to healthcare information, but can be used, or at least there's a reasonable basis to believe can be used, to identify the individual. So social security numbers, addresses, times of appointments, let's say, all sorts of things that you say, well, that's not really traditionally part of the medical record, so to speak. Those are still considered PHI because it's individually identifiable information that has to do with your health that can be used to identify the individual. So that's kind of definitionally where things stand. Now, just a word about other laws. Now, HIPAA only applies if something is PHI. And there may be other federal laws that that apply to it as well. There's consumer protection laws. There's laws having to do with educational confidentiality. Again, very far beyond the scope of today's seminar. But you should keep in mind that just because a piece of information is not necessarily covered by HIPAA, that might not mean that it's not covered by something else. So something to keep in mind there. So who does HIPAA apply to? Again, another question. So there's basically two categories of healthcare organizations. One is called a covered entity and one is called a business associate. So covered entities are, pretty much the obvious healthcare providers. There's some more like esoteric things like a healthcare clearinghouse or a health plan. But basically what you think about as, the traditional organizations or individuals that deliver care, those are covered entities. And I think that would probably describe most of your organizations. In contrast, are business associates. So a business associate is just an organization that gets PHI from a covered entity, and it assists the covered entity with different kind of healthcare functions. So that could be a law firm, an accounting firm, a consulting firm, accreditation agency, something like BHCOE, financial services. So it's important to understand when you're looking at an organization which bucket it falls into, because there are different requirements and obligations depending on whether you are a covered entity versus a business associate. So, let's go under the premise that most of the listeners today are covered entities because you're providers of care. And if you have access to a computer or an electronic device which stores or transmit PHI, you're going to be subject to HIPAA. And so that is broader than simply, the actual healthcare professionals, like a physician or a nurse or some kind of counselor, or, what we think of sort of as licensed or healthcare professionals. That could also be your administrative staff if they have access to files. That could be your IT staff, certainly, because they're probably going to have access to all sorts of PHI within your organization. So I would encourage you, when you're thinking about doing internal HIPAA training or putting together things like your policies and procedures surrounding HIPAA in your organization, to think pretty broadly about, who should be present at those trainings and how they should be trained. But it is also important to understand your relationship with business associates, because if you have sort of a subcontracting organization, and we talked about, things like consulting firms and accounting firms, or even a data storage company or something like that, if you use a third-party vendor that either maintains or transmits or stores PHI on your behalf, you have to have a written business associate agreement with that party. So you've probably heard of business associate agreements, and they seem a lot like boilerplate, but I would say a couple things. One, they're required. Those kind of agreements govern the relationships and the obligations as between you, if you're a covered entity, and whatever subcontractor you're using. So that might allocate things like who's responsible for what to do in the case that a subcontractor has a breach. It might contain things like indemnification provisions, which mean if there's liability that ensues from a particular breach, let's say by your subcontractor, who has to pay that liability? So I would encourage you guys, when you sign things like business associates agreements, to take a good look at them, and just make sure you understand what you're signing and what your obligations are. And very definitely have business associate agreements if you are a covered entity, or even if you're a business associate, with other subcontracting organizations. Because if you don't have those, and either you get audited or there's a breach, that is really going to put you in jeopardy of liability. So let's talk about, getting onto sort of the best practices area. And I should say I'm happy to answer questions at any time during this presentation. We'll definitely have some time closer to the end, but happy if anybody has any questions on what I spoke about so far. Please feel free to jump in. I know it's kind of hard when you get to something at the end and you haven't talked about it, in a half hour or so. You can sort of lose your focus and momentum on it. So please feel free to jump in. And I know Sarah said that she would, kind of moderate any questions. So let's talk about a couple HIPAA principles. So there's a principle called minimum necessary, which is a governing overlay for all of HIPAA. And basically what it says is, and I think this is a mistake that a lot of organizations or people in organizations make, is that, well, I work for a medical practice, I work for a hospital, I work for a clinic, so I'm able to access any of the PHI that clinic is holding. That's not true. You're only able to access information that is the minimum necessary to fulfill your role or job responsibilities. So you need to, bottom line, have a valid reason for doing so. So keep that in mind when you set up your HIPAA compliance infrastructure in your organizations. Who needs to have access to what? It's too easy to just have open file cabinets, open hard drives, and just let anyone from somebody sitting at reception to a care provider have access to everything. And ideally, you should have tiered access and compartmentalize access. So even if you're delivering some sort of care, you don't really have access to PHI about individuals that you're not directly caring for.
I have a question coming in.
Sure.
So the question is, if you see a client at a different location, like a school or a daycare, so you're providing the medical services to that individual in that
Right.
environment,
Right.
are the employees at that location considered business associates or covered entities? And are they responsible for protecting information even though they're not the medical providers?
So if you're just using a site, like you're going into a school, I would say not. I would, I don't think you would need to sign a business associate agreement, because you're not really transmitting PHI to the school. Unless you are, if there's some kind of context where you're, communicating, giving health information to the school based on whatever care you're providing, let's say to teachers or to a school counselor, then I would say yes. Then you should have a BAA really with the school, and you should make sure that whoever's receiving that information, let's say it's the school counselor or a child's teacher, that they understand that they can't, there are obligations to protect that information, and they can't simply disseminate that for no reason or without authorization, and they can use it in for whatever need they need to teach effectively or care for the child who's in their care all day at the school effectively. So in that situation, I'd say yes. If you're really just going on site because it's more convenient for the student, because it's just during the middle of the school day and it's hard for them to get to your clinic or your office, then I would say probably not. You're really just using their space and you're not really giving PHI over to the school itself. I would still, be cognizant of your responsibilities in that context and, be private about it. Don't, have a big list of names of students you're seeing on the door or something in the school that everyone can see, because that's information that you need to protect and be discreet and private. But I don't think you would need a BAA with the school in that situation.
I was just also going to add for context, I think it also depends what your relationship with the school is. So if the school has commissioned you to come out and provide educational services, then that would likely fall under FERPA law. But if you are getting, I hate to tell you to do things differently based on who's paying you, but if the funding is coming from an insurance company, you have a very different liability there. I don't know if you want to add to that, Nick.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. And, it's not so much as to who's writing the check or who's paying, it's just what relationship you have to whom. And, what really is your function? Like, are you actually, kind of delivering services at the site, versus just using the site as a place to, more privately, um, see a student or see a patient or something like that. But who is paying you is probably a good indicator of what the relationship is.
One of the follow-up questions from a different listener is, what if you're giving PHI to the school, but you have a written disclosure from the client? Would you still need a BAA in that situation, or is a disclosure from the patient enough?
You should still have a BAA, because even though the patient's allowing you to disclose that information from the school, you need to contractually set out the school's responsibility to protect that information. Because the school, just because you're allowed to share that information with the school, doesn't mean the school can do whatever it wants with it. They need to, be governed by that BAA. So for example, that BAA might say, if there's a breach of that information, they have to report it to you or something within a certain amount of time. Or that BAA might say that the school has to have policies and procedures in effect and train their staff on how to protect that information. All of those kind of obligations are going to be in the BAA. So I would have both a written authorization and a BAA agreement with the school.
Great. And then one other question that I think you might get to is, how do you know whether your data collection platforms are HIPAA compliant? A lot of the people on the line here probably use like an EMR or EHR system, electronic medical record or data
Yeah.
collection system. How do you determine that?
So it's a good question, and I would say most major ones probably are. I don't know the specifics of any particular EMR that you might be using, but I think the easiest way to find that out is ask them. They're your customers, you pay them. You have a right to say to them, I need this platform to be HIPAA compliant. Can you provide me with information and assurances concerning that? And my guess is any kind of legitimate EMR or established EMR is going to be able to provide you with documentation and some sort of kind of representations and warranties as to that their platform is HIPAA compliant. And if they can't provide you with that, or they balk at providing you with that, that's a little bit of a red flag, because they should be able to. All right. So okay, so let's go on. We're just talking about minimum necessary, which I think is an easy concept, but a really crucial and important concept. So let's move into a little bit of safeguards. So we're going to talk about each of these things. So I'm not going to get into each of the bullet points on the slide, but just to sort of understand, HIPAA security sort of divides three categories of safeguards. One is called administrative, and a lot of it is things like what we're doing today, training and policies and procedures and defined employee access to EPHI. the another bucket is physical, which is kind of the obvious things like lock your file cabinets, don't let visitors into your organization who shouldn't be there, shred things after you're done using them. And the other things are more technical, easy things and difficult things. Easy things like password protection and automatic log off, a little bit more difficult things like encryption and all the other sort of harder IT services that you might use to protect electronic information. So let's translate that a little bit into best practices that are more easy to take home to your organization. So a lot of this, I would say at the outset, you're going to hear me say it and you're going to say, well, that's really obvious. And I agree with you. I think most of this stuff is really obvious. And what I like to, what I constantly tell people, particularly about HIPAA compliance, is that it's not, many of the things we do are not that hard. And that was kind of my tagline, I think, in the marketing material for this seminar is HIPAA compliant, HIPAA breaches are almost always preventable. They're almost always preventable because they're generally the result of human error and not doing, very basic things. And I think people make the mistake of seeing HIPAA compliance as something that, well, that's for really large organizations. I mean, if I were UCLA hospital system, yeah, I could spend millions of dollars on HIPAA and, make sure I'm compliant. But I'm just, a smaller provider of autism services, so I can't be expected to do that. And I don't think that's a great way to look at things because yeah, you can spend millions of dollars on HIPAA compliance, sure. Just like for your house, you can spend, thousands and thousands of dollars on a high-tech laser alarm system. But if you're not going to lock your door, and you're not going to make sure your windows are closed when you leave the house, then that $1 million alarm system isn't going to do much for you. And that's, I think, the message that I would tell you guys is it's worth talking about this stuff, even though there's nothing on these lists that you haven't heard of, because you have to make sure to keep them first and foremost in your mind and create a culture in your own organizations of compliance where these types of things are, going to be first and foremost in your colleagues' minds. Basic things like don't have electronic devices which store information that are not password protected. You would be surprised, and there are people I know that have iPhones, smartphones, whatever, without passwords on them. And I don't mean because they have fingerprint. I mean no password at all, just because it's easier and no one wants to waste their time. Little things like locking your computer screen. You're going to walk away from your desk to go eat lunch. Put your computer screen on lock, hit Control-Alt-Delete, and have it that you need to get a password to get back in. Workstation security. Be cognizant of what you're leaving around your workstation. Be cognizant of who might be looking over your shoulder, where you're situated in a room. If, patients or guests or people who are not from your organization especially are walking around, what you're securing and what's left out in the open. Things like portable device security, we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail. Very simple, have antivirus software. That is, again, nothing that anybody hasn't heard of and nothing that's expensive. There are, for dollars a month, really good antivirus products out there. And I don't know if you guys, some of the big breaches that happened in healthcare over the course of the last year or so. One of them was the WannaCry virus. Really, cost millions and millions of dollars worldwide to healthcare organizations and hospitals. Excuse me. And it turned out if you would have just had, all of the major antivirus products, if you would have just had updated antivirus, wouldn't have cracked your system. So, for a $19 a month fix, or for lack of a $19 a month fix, organizations had to deal with this and lose millions of dollars. And sometimes it happens, you're prompted for updates, to allow updates, whether it's in your virus or your Windows system, or sometimes, different software you're using that updates automatically, but you have to tell it, okay, go ahead and update now. And none of us like to do that because you know what? I want to go home at the end of the day. Sometimes I'm shutting down my computer and it asks me to update and, I'm coming in the morning and I have a lot of work to do and I want to get started and I turn something on and it asks me to update and it might take an extra 5 minutes and I'm so tempted to say, oh, I'll do it later, not now. those kind of updates, which are generally free, are crucial to your IT security, because um, they are constantly, these systems and these software companies are constantly patching their software with defenses against various kinds of viruses and hacking and things like that. So really, really important, when you talk about ROI, return on your investment of time, that is probably one of the biggest ROI things you can do, is keep things updated. So let's move on a little bit. So passwords we talked about. Best practices. Number one, again, real obvious, but use cryptic passwords that can't be easily guessed. You always see these statistics online, and they'll say something like 40% of the passwords in the United States are like things like the person's name 123, or password one, or the name of your dog. And just to kind of tell you an anecdotal story, my oldest son is a little bit of a techie, but a teenager, and we were over at a friend's house, and we were trying to get onto their Wi-Fi system. And without even asking them, my son says to me, 16, says, "I bet I can guess their password in 5 tries or less." And I was like, "Okay, you're on, go for it." Sure enough, 3-4 times in, he guessed their password, because it was like their address and last name. And he's like, "Everybody does it." He's like, "I could hack into anyone in the neighborhood practically, or half the neighborhood, because I'm going to be able to guess their password in under 10 attempts before I get locked out," because people use just really obvious passwords. So true story. So, and protect those passwords. Not real effective if you have a really good password, but then you put it on a sticky note and stick it up on your monitor. Use combinations. A lot of the newer systems are forcing you to have cryptic passwords and combinations of capitalizations and numbers and punctuations, but do that. And real importantly, change your password on a regular basis. You can set your system so that it forces you to do it every 90 days. It's kind of a pain in the butt, because then you have to remember a whole new password, but it's really worth doing. And one thing that's not up there that I would say is, don't use the same password multiple times. Don't make your bank account password your laptop password, or your email password or something like that, your Gmail or Yahoo password, because what might happen is somebody will hack into one, and I promise you, if they get that password, they're going to try it out on your bank account, and they'll figure out what your bank account is, because they'll be looking through your emails, and they'll see some email from your bank, and they'll wind up being able to log in and have your email and password. So be really, really careful not to share passwords, because if something does get hacked, and it does, at least you won't kind of give someone access to everything. Locking your computer screen, like we talked about. Use a password to start off, and use a system that automatically logs off your computer after a period of inactivity. This is true in offices, but it's particularly true because more and more of us are doing work. Even in some of the questions that was asked, I know that all of you are bringing your electronic devices. You might be sitting in a coffee shop before you're seeing a patient or a client, or some kind of appointment, or you might be, doing something in a school, and you get up from your desk, you go up to get a napkin or something like that. Have your computer automatically logged off, not only because someone might see what's over your shoulder when they're walking by, but if somebody does go ahead and steals that laptop, you want it to be automatically logged off, because that's going to make it a lot harder for them to get in. If they're already in, they could factory reset your laptop in 2.5 seconds, and then it's their laptop. Or even worse, they could just export all the data that you have on there, and if there's PHI or probably other valuable things, you're going to be in trouble. So workstation security, again, we talked about physically secure your area and physically secure PHI in particular. If you have things like portable equipment, external hard drives and things like that, make sure those are secure. Be careful where you leave things. Again, so many of us, me included, are doing so much of our work on the road, in airports and coffee shops and things like that. Really easy to leave something behind, or have it get swiped. Happens pretty quickly, and unfortunately, there are literally people who go ahead and make it their business to look for unattended computers, because they know there's money out there, not only in what they in particular, the value of your particular device, but if you have there's black market rates out there for things like PHI, and PHI is particularly lucrative to steal, because you can do all sorts of things like submit false bills to provide, set up a fake provider and submit false bills. If I have your PHI and, run up tens of thousands of dollars in false billing, which you're going to have to deal with unwinding as the fraudulent patient, but also it makes that information really valuable and saleable out there on, kind of the black market. And, you know, when it's as attractive as that, there are just a lot of people hunting for that kind of information. Fax machines, we were using them less and less today, but in healthcare, they, tend to still be a little more widely used than in other industries. Make sure you're locating them in a right place, not in a public and common area, and that only authorized people are accessible, or they're accessible only to authorized people. Make, make sure when you're sending out a fax that you're reaching, the right source. It's really easy to transpose numbers. I would really recommend using a cover sheet so that a recipient, if they get your fax erroneously, it's pretty clear, very early on, who it's from, who it was supposed to go to, and that they got it incorrectly, and chances are they're going to shred it or something or call you. So, make sure that fax number is correct. Probably the leading cause of PHI breaches. Usually those are manageable and turn out not to be a big deal, but not always true. You could wind up sending someone's social security number and address, and once somebody has that, it's really easy to start doing things like opening up a bank account in their name. So if you send it to the wrong person. So be particularly sensitive to fax machines, because they literally are the leading, transposing numbers or sending something to the wrong recipient is literally the leading cause of, some of these simple HIPAA breaches. Telephones and cell phones. So ideally, do not use text messaging when you're communicating PHI. Don't share it over text. And if you have to communicate with something like that, de-identify the information. Don't put things that are going to make that information individually identifiable and tied to a particular individual. And there are much safer texting like applications out there, like WhatsApp, which has like peer-to-peer encryption and things like that. A lot, I would much, I'm sort of reticent to recommend to anybody to use texting to transmit PHI, just because I think it's easy to get careless with. And easier to breach. But if you're going to do that, and I know, a lot of doctors tell me, or other healthcare professionals know, we have to do this, it's really the only way we can communicate. So make sure you're using a HIPAA compliant texting platform. And, telephone, again, and this applies, for texting as well, share the minimum necessary information, de-identify it, and, be careful what you're doing, especially over the telephone, especially when you might be leaving messages, because you don't necessarily know who has access to those messages. You could have a phone number for a client or for a patient, think you're leaving a message on their private cell phone number, but it turns out it's on their work number and it's a general line, or it's their home number, but they didn't want their everyone in the household to know that they have an appointment for tomorrow that you were checking out on, or something. That's autism related or behavioral health related, particularly when we work in a field where there is, more sensitivity than most, I think, to privacy for good reason. It's good ethics, it's good compliance, and it's really just good business sense, because you don't want to have a reputation as an organization that's being careless about someone's privacy, no matter what the actual regulations say. So laptops and portable devices, really don't keep unencrypted data on portable devices. I would rather see, I would tell any client, have a portal system where if you're working remotely, you're not actually storing any kind of data on the hard drive of the device itself. If you have to do that, make sure that the data that you're storing is encrypted, make sure the device itself is password protected, and really ideally use a device that can be remotely wiped. more and more laptops today are coming out with non-removable hard drives. So I think that's going to be the case for most of the newer ones. It used to be more in the past that you could open up a laptop, and so even if something was password protected, remove the hard drive and plug it into something else. But it's really good if, if it's non-removable, which basically means that if someone were to try to remove it, it would corrupt the information in it, so it would be unusable, because inevitably a laptop is going to get stolen. You're going to leave it in your car. A car might get stolen. You're going to leave it in a coffee shop. So you have to sort of prepare yourself for the worst. And the ideal situation is, if that unfortunate event occurs, that there really is no danger of a HIPAA breach, because the data's on there is inaccessible to whoever might have swiped the computer. And encryption, password protection, remote wiping is the way to do that. Antivirus software, we talked about keeping that up to date. Computer security. So, be very careful. It's getting more and more common about installing unknown or unsolicited programs on your computer. That can generally come in the form of email, or if you go on some website that looks a little bit sketchy and you click on something that seems too good to be true to download. Very often those are those might contain viruses, or those might give someone entree into not only your computer or a system. So if you ever have questions about that and you have an IT person you work with, before even clicking on a link or even clicking on an email that looks suspicious, forward it to that IT person and have them, ask them first. One good tip is, there are, it's becoming harder and harder to distinguish between real email and sort of fake emails that you're getting. In the not so many years ago, most of those emails were like 50% off Viagra, and you were pretty sure that your grandmother wasn't sending you an email that she had started a new career selling Viagra at 50% off, so you could ignore the email. But more and more of these emails are looking realistic, and they're looking like they come internally from your organizations. I get them once in a while where it'll purport to be an email from one of my partners that says, hey, I'm traveling, can you wire money to so-and-so account? We need to, refund a client. And I think they just, go out there and find your email somewhere, which isn't that hard. And then they spoof the email. And it's, people have showed me websites where you can just like do this for free and make an email look like it came from somebody else. Usually if you actually click on the email itself, you'll see that it's sort of like this weird corrupted email address, and you'll know that it's fake. But be really sensitive to that. And if something looks suspicious, even mildly suspicious, be suspect of it, because that's a real way that people are entering systems and doing phishing expeditions today. So when you're outgoing email, so we talked about suspicious emails, delete spam emails. When you are providing PHI over email to a third party, I would highly, highly recommend using an encrypted platform. There are tons of them out there today that are very good and very inexpensive and easy to use. Probably the best ones are ones where there is a password associated with them that is sort of pre-established between you and the recipient, and you send them an email and they can't open that or open the associated file unless they have the password. So if it goes to a wrong person or somebody intercepts that in some way, they're not going to be able to access to it. And so you can do that on the email itself. And sometimes I know like Adobe has a function where you could password protect, opening an Adobe document. I think you can do it in Excel and other type of documents like that. Takes an extra step, takes an extra minute. Sometimes I'm annoyed too when I get an email from my bank and it's about something really stupid, but I have to enter in my password to find out what it is. And you're always tempted to kind of say, forget about it. Why do I need to send it this way? I know who I'm sending it to. Resist that urge, because that's going to serve you well in the long run. Kind of a separate issue, disposing of PHI. So you have to, HIPAA only applies for 50 years, hasn't been around for 50 years. So, when we get to that point, we can get to that point. But until now, if you are destroying information destroying PHI, whether it's paper-based or whether it's electronic-based, be careful how you're disposing it, because you don't want to do something like, take a big box of medical files, throw them in the dumpster behind your building, and then have somebody dumpster dive and find it. And I know that sounds unlikely, but these kind of breaches have happened because of this. People know where healthcare organizations live, so to speak. What I was saying before is that there's high value put on this information, so there's going to be people who are willing to go through a trash can and see if there's anything valuable in there. So make sure when you're, doing something as simple as throwing out paper PHI, that you shred it and you make it, no longer recognizable. It happens as well for electronic PHI. It's not so simple just to throw a computer in the garbage, because there's hard drives on there, and even if you delete it, the information, unless it's been overwritten, it's very likely still on that hard drive. So, there's different ways that you can destroy PHI effectively. A really good one is just like pulverizing it to death, and be sensitive to different kinds of things that actually have hard drives that you wouldn't think of. First of all, your phone, if you're getting rid of it. Second of all, things like photocopy machines and fax machines. Very often, the modern ones don't work like the old ones do. The modern ones actually take a picture of whatever you're photocopying and then store that picture on an internal hard drive. So if you throw out a copy machine, there may be thousands and thousands of pages of medical record that you might have been photocopying or scanning or whatever, that's still there. So be sensitive to that, because unfortunately we live in a world where people really are looking for that kind of information. Another element of HIPAA compliance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these things at the end, but we're doing one of the elements right now, which is effective training. And I think training, the recommendation.
Question.
Yeah.
Quick question, just back about your disposal side. If you're scanning all of the records for electronic record keeping, when are you allowed to shred the paper version? Like the question is, I'm paranoid that I'll have to produce a hard copy at some point in the future.
Well, first of all, if you also have it in electronic copy, you could get rid of the paper version immediately, as long as you can, access it in hard copy. But as far as how long you have to hold on to different records, so it depends on what state you're in terms of medical records. My recollection is in California, I think it's 10 years under state law, and it also depends on the age of the patient. If you're talking about a patient who is a minor, I believe you have to hold on to that till the minor turns 18. So if you saw a patient who's 6 years old, you would have to keep it for longer than the 10 years.
Yeah, this one's in Alaska, but I think that, just to clarify, then, so there's no legal requirement to keep a original copy of any of the record.
I mean, unless there's something different under Alaska law that requires that I don't necessarily know about. I would think that if you have an electronic copy of anything, that should be sufficient.
Great. One more question is, one of the questions is related to the service they use for email encryption, but if someone emails them, the email just goes straight into their inbox. So I guess the question is, what's the responsibility of you receiving an email that's not encrypted?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, on one hand, it's not, if someone chooses to send you PHI that's unencrypted, the onus is basically on them. But you want to, what I would do in that situation, if you have a concern, if somebody is sending you something, I would write them back and tell them, got this, in the future though, it might be best to, use some kind of compliant platform. So there's like, there's different systems that you don't have to email it, like a Dropbox sort of thing, where they would put it into a shared folder that's protected, that only you can access, or they could use an encrypted system. But I would put in writing your concern about it, and if somebody chooses to keep sending you something that's kind of unprotected, ultimately there's not a lot you can do. But I would at least put once in writing that this is what you recommend, that they send it in a more secure manner.
Yeah, and I was going to add, at BHCOE, we look at HIPAA when we do your guys' BHCOE audits. And so we absolutely make a record of that because you do transmit PHI to us, and we look to see whether you're transmitting that to us in a way that is HIPAA compliant. And you will either get docked on the audit, or we'll give you that feedback in real time if you're doing it in a way that's not recommended as well.
Yeah, that's it. That's what I would do. Any other questions?
I don't see any others.
All right. So talking about EPHI security assessment. So I was going to talk about this a few slides from now, but I really see like 3 pillars of HIPAA compliance, and I think this goes to my messaging that it doesn't really have to be all that complicated. And the 3 pillars are: one is training, which we're doing now, which the OCR, which is the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Health and Human Services, recommends you do on at least a yearly basis for all your staff, and within 30 days of hire to new staff. So that's one element.
By the way, you guys can use this video to train your staff. So once this video is up, that can be the training that you have them sit through as well.
Yeah, the thing I would add to that is make sure you're documenting that you're doing that and who's attending the training and the dates and the times and sign-ins and stuff like that, because getting back to shield and sword, training is great, but if you can't prove that you did it 6 months from now, if you have to prove that you did it, then it's just that much less valuable that you did it. Still good to do, but definitely document that you've done it. So one is training. Another element is policies and procedures, and we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. And a third element is doing a security assessment on your EPHI. So again, recommendations to do this on an annual basis, and you can self-assess. Sometimes it's nice, depending on your organization size and sophistication and complexity and resources, to use an outside auditing organization, but there are ways of doing it internally, and there's roughly 28 security measures that are either required or addressable under HIPAA, and you sort of go through those and score them for your organization, and figure out areas that you need to remediate or make more robust. So that's something you should think about doing, and we'll talk a little bit about how to do that kind of later in this presentation. But I kind of wanted to make all of you listeners aware of kind of the 3 areas of HIPAA compliance. And again, I think that one thing to keep in mind, because it tends to be overwhelming to think about it, is the government recognizes and courts recognize that there is no one size fits all in terms of HIPAA compliance. Your obligation as let's say a relatively small rural clinic is going to be different than your obligation if you are a massive Fortune 500 multi-state healthcare organization with thousands of providers and employees. So keep that in mind, but still keep in mind the structure of HIPAA compliance, because at its own level, you're going to want to implement that in your organization. So second thing is HIPAA training, which we just talked about. Train your staff, train your volunteers, train upon hire and annually, and document that. And, appoint somebody in your organization to be the HIPAA privacy officer, and, make sure that person is made aware of all their responsibilities, and also that people within your organizations know that they have someone to go to with questions or anything like that. So let's talk about breaches, and the first thing I would say is people tend to probably consistent with what I said before, people tend to fear the sky is falling if they suspect a breach situation. So I think it's important to talk through it a little bit and see what your next steps might be if you suspect a breach. And how you might want to resolve that. But I should say at the onset that if you have a serious situation, you should make sure you're getting good outside advice. If you might have legal counsel that knows this, that you're already doing work with. Consulting organizations like mine can help you a little bit and talk about what to do next and how to handle it. But these things are very often, you know, remediable, if that's a word, and you know, as long as you catch it sort of in the early stages, but you should act fast and, you know, sort of make sure you know what you're doing. So first, kind of definitionally, what a breach is, because there are probably a lot of things that people think of as a HIPAA breach that really aren't. So, you know, a breach can be unauthorized acquisition of data um, that compromises either the security or the confidentiality or integrity of personal information maintained by the organization. So that's, you know, is as it sounds. That's someone breaking into your office and, you know, stealing computers or something like that. One might be an improper disclosure or usage of PHI by internally by your vendor or staff member. So it doesn't have to be an outside breach. If somebody, you know, you might remember this story that happened in UCLA where, you know, because of geography and size, you know, treat celebrities, and a particular celebrity was a patient, and there was, you know, a bunch of staff members peeking in on, you know, that celebrity's PHI, and they all got in trouble, and there were big fines to UCLA, and they, you know, they didn't really have the required tiered access security that would have prevented that from happening. So you could actually have a HIPAA breach that's caused by, you know, improper usage within your organization or improper disclosure. So somebody, you know, in your workforce, you know, sends that fax to the wrong address or something like that. And so the important thing to remember is those kinds of, you know, 1 and 2 up there on the slide are presumed to be a breach unless you can demonstrate as either the covered entity, their business associate, whatever your organization might be, that there's a low probability that the PHI has been compromised. So let's talk about how you figure that out. So you think that there's going, you know, you think you might suspect a breach, and let's use the hypothetical and really common situation that somebody sent an email unencrypted, you know, unsecured, containing PHI, and instead of sending it to the right person, there's an autofill on the to field, you know, in your email, like we all do, and you wind up sending it to the wrong person. So you're going to do something called a risk assessment as your next step, and that risk assessment is going to measure, well, what was the nature and extent of the PHI involved, and that's why it was really important to talk about the definition of PHI in the beginning of this webinar, because you even need to know, well, you know, was there PHI? Does it fit the definition? And what's the nature and the extent of it? You know, is it something really egregious like address, social security number, names, medical condition, or is it something, you know, a little less risky, so to speak? And then you're going to look at who was that unauthorized person to whom that disclosure was made. So, you know, going back to our hypothetical about sending an email to the wrong person, there's going to be a big difference whether you sent that to, you know, your Aunt Sally instead of the client or some other provider that you needed to send that PHI to, or you sent it to a completely wrong person, you know, who's you know, who's potentially dangerous in terms of receiving that PHI. So, you know, if it's to your Aunt Sally, well, that's good. You know, let's move on to the next step. That's going to govern how you react to this. If it's to somebody who, you know, by mistake, I sent it to, you know, 1,000 people on an email list, well, that's obviously much worse. Then you're going to consider whether the PHI was actually acquired or viewed. So, you know, how do you find this out? Well, if it's to your Aunt Sally, you immediately get on the phone and you call her and you say, hey, I just sent you something that you shouldn't have received from work. It was a total mistake. And, you know, she's obviously going to respond, oh, okay, I wondered what that was. You want me just to delete it? Sure. And, you know, why don't you write me an email confirming the deletion or something like that? And you're going to be able to, you know, one, determine whether it was actually acquired or viewed. In the case we're talking about, no. And you're going to, you know, document that you confirmed that it was deleted. And then, you know, putting all these things together, you're going to determine to the extent to which the risk of the PHI has been mitigated. And, you know, in the Aunt Sally case, well, you've probably fully mitigated that PHI. So the conclusion you're going to come to, but you're going to document this conclusion by documenting how you've done all these steps, and you're going to, come to the conclusion that there really wasn't a breach. And that's all fine and good. You're going to document that. You're going to report that internally. You might take corrective actions regarding that and say, hey, you know what? We really need to, train people better in being, more careful about who they send PHI to via email. Maybe I need to talk to my IT guy and tell her to turn off the auto-populate in the to list, because that's just too, that's just too risky and too likely to result in a mistake. Something like that, and you would document that as well. But that was, in a very simple sense. Obviously, it can be much worse than that. And if you're in a situation where you sent it out to 2,000 people nationally, and some of those people are people that you don't know, that's when you're probably going to want to get outside advice and see what your obligations are and your next steps. So talk a little bit about breach exclusions, which basically means, there might have been a breach, but they're excluded from the definition of breach. One is internal, unintentional use of PHI by a workforce member or person, who's acting under the authority of a covered entity. So you're a covered entity. This is a person who's working for you. One of your medical professionals, a nurse, let's say, accidentally accesses a chart for Mr. Jones instead of Mrs. Jones. Technically a breach? Yeah, it's an exclusion though, because that just doesn't rise, that's an exclusion. It doesn't rise to the level of an actual breach. External, you inadvertently disclosed it to someone who's allowed to access PHI at an organization to another person allowed to access PHI for the same entity. So, you have an outside consultant that's working with you. You had a quality assurance consultant that's, auditing some charts. You sent her the wrong patient chart. So, it was inadvertent. That was somebody who, you sent it to somebody who generally is allowed to access PHI from your entity. You can talk to that person and say, hey, don't look at that. It was, greater than the minimum necessary that I should have sent you. So just ignore it. Again, breach exclusion, don't worry about it. I would document it, but it's a breach exclusion. Information that can't be retained. So, if the party who you sent it to was not reasonably able to retain the information. So, let's say there was some PHI sitting on the copy machine. A visitor came by and by mistake was using the copy machine and picked up that PHI. And then they said, oh, hey, who does this belong to? They never really retained the information. Again, that's a breach exclusion, kind of under the same reasons that we said before. I might still document that situation, but I would document that it's a breach exclusion. I'm going to talk really, really briefly about reporting breaches. The reason I'm going to be so brief about it is because I know people are from all over the country. And I also, I think people have to make their own sort of internal organizational rules about who does things like reporting breaches. But all I'm going to say to you is, if you suspect a breach, and there may be a situation where reporting that breach is required. So you've gone through your risk assessment and determined that there really was a breach, and it's, there's some risk to it, and there's, multiple people. You might have a reporting obligation. It might depend on your own state's law. Certainly you should be reporting that up the chain to your HIPAA privacy officer. I don't think anybody should act alone. And you should report that and figure out, do you have to notify the affected individuals? Do you have to notify, relevant government organizations? So I'm telling you this not to memorize, particular California rules, but that you should be aware there may be reporting obligations in certain situations, and that you should make sure that you're doing that correctly, and that you have policies and procedures set up for that. If there's a breach that occurs by a business associate that you're using, generally because of the business associate agreement, they're going to have to notify the covered entity immediately. You have to have your own internal policies and procedures as to what to do next. Generally, the BAA is going to make the business associate liable for the breach. However, you may still have obligations, to help mitigate that breach, depending on the situation. This is a little bit about fines and penalties, and there's different sort of levels of HIPAA breach. That's my fire and brimstone trying to scare you, but all I'll leave you with this slide is that HIPAA violations, can be pretty serious, and they can be very expensive. They can, cost your organization millions of dollars. And one of the things I would say on that is that we live, it's even beyond the financial penalties. That we live in a world right now where there's a lot of public outrage out there. Because there have been a lot of high-profile breaches, particularly in healthcare, and particularly because, as I said, the information that we deal with in this particular sub-industry in healthcare is particularly sensitive. There's a lot of, kind of populist anger, I would call it, about organizations being careless with their information. So forgetting about the legal aspects of it, having a breach is bad for business. You don't want to get a reputation in the market for being an organization that's careless with someone's private information, particularly in this field. So, it's the right thing to do. It's the regulatory compliant thing to do, and it makes the most business sense as well. So, just to underscore why, I think HIPAA compliant is important. And I just kind of summarized, I think, what I was going to say on this slide. You want to demonstrate that your organization is one that clients and patients can trust. And so, when you're an employee or a part of the workforce of an organization and you violate policies and procedures of your organization, you're careless with things, you're exposing your own organization to liability, and you're exposing yourself, and sometimes to personal liability. Let me just pause for 1 second and ask, is any questions on anything I said? I have, a couple more minutes of slides, and then I'll open up to, we'll have, 5-10 minutes for some broader questions as well.
I don't see any yet, but let's see if they,
Okay.
And as you pause.
So let me close with a couple of things, and you've heard me kind of say it before in the context of this. Don't make the mistake of spending time and resources on risk management, and particularly HIPAA compliance, and then fail to document it, because unfortunately, in many cases, the sort of compliance activities, compliance related activities that you do as an organization are, they may be valuable in and of themselves, but in a certain sense, they're only as valuable as you're able to document and prove that you did. If you,
I do have one question.
Sure. Go ahead.
Take a pause on it. So one of the questions is, with parental consent, can client information like name, age, and phone be shared with other parents within the organization if the kids already know each other and each other's names, know each other's ages?
Yeah, I mean the bottom line is if you can get a consent for anything, just make sure, there are some regulations that revolve around consent, like like that the consent has to be fairly specific as to the people you can disclose it to. So you can't just say generally you can disclose it to anyone you want. It has to be pretty specific as to the information for which the authorization or the consent is relating to. So if it's just for name and contact information, it should specifically state it's just for name and contact information, and obviously not for the entire medical record. Also, consents can't be like open-ended perpetual. They have to have some kind of end date, either a specific date or kind of like a contingent date that says, this is valid until this and this happens. So, I would recommend not having a consent that exceeded 1 year and just getting, a new consent at the end of that year. So yeah, the short answer is you can pretty much, get a consent to do anything. Be careful about things like Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups and stuff like that, not because they're per se a regulatory violation. You can do it, but they're just so easy to, result in some kind of oversharing, or somebody doesn't have the right privacy and security settings set up on Facebook, and all of a sudden, things are publicized. So I think that if you're going to do that, just be very careful about what you're sharing to who, and making sure that it's much better if the parents share things among themselves, because they have no HIPAA obligations, and then you're sort of out of the mix in terms of risk, and then you sort of don't have to constantly be vigilant as to what's happening with that information.
One more question coming in, and this is
Sure.
kind of leading us to the big question that I think we talked about even on our last training, Nick, is are you allowed to display children's photos around the center if you receive consent from the parents on a yearly basis?
Yeah, I mean, you can if again, if they're giving their consent, you could do it. Um, I would I would just make sure that it's worth the risk in terms of documenting, and you are taking on a little bit of risk in doing it, because you might have a consent that expires, and you just might get someone who decides, mom signed this but dad didn't, or something like that. But you can. You can go ahead and do it, and if you think that's a worthwhile thing to do from a treatment perspective, from a business perspective, then get the right consents, make sure they're specific and they fulfill all the other consent requirements, and then go ahead and do it. But be cognizant of how long they're up there and who's coming in and seeing them and things like that.
And I just want to add to that, per the BHCOE guidelines, we don't recommend using patients for marketing purposes, just for concerns related to exploitation and things like that. But we are in the process of reviewing those marketing guidelines, and we have a subcommittee actually working right now to kind of assess those. So you guys might be receiving a survey soon about that, asking you about your preferences as well. One of the questions is, how often should a new consent be signed? And typically we recommend every year if you are engaging in that behavior. And then I see another question coming in, Nick, really quickly about disclosure consent. So if you have a consent to share information with the client's doctor,
Mm-hmm.
would you need a BAA with the doctor's office, or is just the consent to share appropriate?
So technically, if you're sharing it for the purposes of treatment, you shouldn't need a BAA. The consent should be sufficient. Yeah, but it wouldn't surprise me if they're interacting with you a lot, that they just may have you sign one as a BAA, or as another covered entity to covered entity. But technically, you can share things without a BAA for purposes of treatment.
Great, that was the last one I had.
Okay, so we'll have a couple minutes again in the end for questions if anybody else still has, but let me just kind of leave you with a couple of things. So we talked about 3 pillars of HIPAA compliance, and the one on the bottom left, the HIPAA training, we've done, or we're in the middle of, or at the end of. I would very much recommend that you make sure that you have proper policies and procedure in place. If it's one of the things that my organization does a lot for different kinds of providers, and if it's something that you're interested in, I know that Sarah will probably share my contact information, and you can write to me. But you're sort of here if you've just done the HIPAA training, and you should really make an effort to check those other boxes. And what I'll tell you is, I can send you something. If you email me after the seminar, I'll send you kind of an EPHI risk assessment template that you can use to self-assess. So if you go ahead and use that, and most of these things probably don't require the sophistication of someone who's a dedicated IT guy. I think probably best on, if you're the owner or the operator or an office manager or something like that, can probably handle it. But again, I'll ask Sarah to share my email, and anybody who
Just put
writes
it
to
in
me.
the comment. So if you can access the chat, his email is in the chat. It's nmerkin@Compliagent.
Yeah, and I'll have it on the last slide too, so I'll leave it up if anybody wants to copy it down from there. And anyway, I'll send you guys a risk assessment. Go ahead and do it, fix things that need to be fixed, and file that away, and do something like that every year, and then you'll have 2 out of the 3. kind of HIPAA compliance, sort of those major categories fixed. So, one thing I want to say is, this is my least important person in the room slide. And I always want to close by saying, compliance is kind of a drag and kind of a pain because, and I'll say it flat out, I'm the least important person in the room for the following reason, because, what you guys are doing all day is vastly more important than what I do. And, you guys are treating and assisting and helping a pretty vulnerable population in society. And that's, righteous and important work. And oftentimes things like compliance can seem to get in the way of that. And so what I would encourage you though to do is look at compliance as an opportunity to do the right thing, both from a regulatory perspective, from an ethical perspective, and from a business perspective, so that 99.999% of the rest of the time, you don't have to reactively deal with these kind of issues. Put the time in the beginning, as I sort of opened with, and be able to be free to really spend your time doing the more important work that all of you are doing on a daily basis, and that's delivering the great care that that you're delivering to a population who really needs it. So that being said, thank you guys for your attention and your participation. And I think just by being here, you're and your colleagues knowing that you're taking some time out of your day to do this, you're really establishing a culture within your organization of compliance, which is really, really important and effective. And that's my contact information. If you have any questions that you'd rather put in writing regarding this, I'll try to respond to everyone. Again, if you want that EPHI risk assessment material, I'll send that to you as well. And I think we have a couple minutes for questions before we close, which I'm happy to take.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. That was fantastic. And I mean it when I say Nick is one of the most charismatic speakers I know about HIPAA. It's hard to make HIPAA exciting and fun and engaging, and Nick does all of those things. So I was really excited.
Hear me when I'm not talking about HIPAA, I'm even more exciting. Fun and engaging.
Yeah, so quick housekeeping item, please contact Nick. Compliagent also does custom policies and procedures for HIPAA, so they can make it state specific and kind of get all your ducks in a row there. And they are BHCOE compliant as well. And I see one question coming in is about whether Gmail is HIPAA compliant. I think there was a discussion about that earlier in the webinar, which is that you need to sign a business associates agreement with Google Suite to get that HIPAA compliant. So you can't use a generic Gmail address. You have to use a Google business address.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Yeah, they'll see if more questions come in. While I'm waiting for more questions to come in, I'm getting a lot of questions about continuing education units. So when you registered for the webinar, you were asked for your BACB number. So we have that information for you. What we're going to do now is shortly after the webinar, you will receive a survey asking you to review the webinar and then also disclose that information once again. We need that survey to be able to send your CEU certificates. The survey will be open for 24 hours, so please fill it out today if you can. And you should get a CEU certificate tomorrow. If for some reason you don't, you can email assistant@bhcoe.org, and I'm going to put that email in there as well. But usually everyone gets one, and we don't have any stragglers. But if for some reason, check your spam, check your other folder, and make sure that you are looking there for that email with your CEU certificate. With that being said, if we don't have any other questions, I'll let you guys, we got one more coming in. Question is, when we have kids in the community, some say it's a HIPAA violation to use the child's name or wear our uniforms, like our therapeutic uniforms, with our names on it. What do you think about that, Nick?
Well, I don't think it's an issue to wear a uniform with your name on it. I guess I could see that if you are, sort of being very public about what you're doing, and if you're, somewhere in public with a group of kids, that someone's going to be able to associate, with autism treatment, you might want to be a little more discreet about it, just because, forgetting even about the HIPAA, strict regulatory aspects, which is probably not really a violation. But I think that there's sensitivity in the community that people might, it's a good question that I don't, Sarah, you may have a better take on it, because I know you probably want to wear a uniform because you want to be able to identify yourselves to to the children and things like that. But I think there's probably some sensitivity in best to stay, a little bit lower key if you can. But I don't know, Sarah, you might have a good answer to that one.
Yeah, we do get questions about that. I think a lot of clinics use scrubs, staff members use scrubs, and I think that might be a little bit ostracizing, or have some stigma related to it when you're out in the community wearing something like scrubs. But I don't know if a name tag necessarily does that. I think the concern isn't about your identity as the clinician. I think it's more about if someone comes up and says, oh, what's wrong with the kid, or is something, why are you with him? That's where you kind of need to be a little bit more careful. But I don't see, I don't know. It's a tough one. I can see why that's a challenging question to answer, because technically a name is a name independent of whether someone has a medical condition or not. But I would say probably a last name is something you definitely don't want to disclose, or where they go to school, or where they live, or any of that more sensitive information.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all for your time today. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to listen to some HIPAA training. And thank you, Nick, again, for an amazing presentation. And we look forward to seeing you guys next month. If you recall, it's just, again, the same time next June, we're going to be doing our annual report review. So feel free to tune into that. We'll have some really great data then. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.